This is the third part for activity 3, translating a line. In this part, what I want to do is compare dividing the coordinate for y by the coordinate for x. I want to compare that to dividing the change in y divided by the change in x, which we're calling the vertical change divided by the horizontal change. So if you divide the coordinates for x and y, so this graph, if you go to x 0 and y 3/2, you're going to go to a point on that graph. So if you divide 3/2 by 0, or if you divide 7/2 by 1, or 4.5 by 1.5, or 7 divided by 11/4, what do you get? And what does that mean compared to dividing by the vertical change and the horizontal change? So let's do the first part, just dividing by the coordinates. Well, 3/2 divided by 0, you can't divide anything by 0. If you imagine taking 1.5 slices of pizza and dividing that among 0 people, it doesn't make any sense. You can't do that. So what we call that is undefined. So any number divided by 0 is undefined. But 7/2 divided by 1 is 7/2. Any number divided by 1 is that number, 7/2, which is also equal to 3.5. And 9/2 divided by 3/2, well, 9 of anything divided by 3 of that same thing is going to equal 3. So 9/2 times, so if you use the inverse operation, which is multiplication, and the multiplicative inverse of 3/2, so you're going to multiply 9/2 times 2/3. That's the multiplicative inverse. These 2's cancel. 9 divided by 3 is 3. And finally, 7 divided by 11/4 is the same as 7 times, so inverse operation and multiplicative inverse is the same as 28/11. Well, 28/11 is 2. That's 22/11 plus 6/11 left over. So 2 and 6/11. So notice these are all different, which tells you, first of all, that it's not a proportional relationship. And I don't really know what meaning any of these have. You don't get anywhere by taking the coordinate of a point, that's the y coordinate, and dividing by the x coordinate if it's not a proportional relationship. What you have to look at is what's the change, what's the vertical change compared to the horizontal change, so the change in y divided by the change in x. Now let's go through that. If you're moving from an x coordinate of 0 to 1, that's a 1 unit change. So imagine you're moving along the x-axis 1 unit. And if you're moving from a y coordinate of 3/2 to a y coordinate of 7/2, that's a change of that's a change of 4/2. Sorry about that. And so you're moving from 3/2 and you're going up to 7/2. So how much has that changed? You're going to take where you end up and subtract where you started. So 7/2 minus 3/2. 7/2 minus 3/2 is equal to 4/2. And the horizontal change was 1 unit. 1 minus 0 is 1 unit. Well, 4/2 divided by 1 equals 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And so let's look at another one. So if you move from 1 to 1.5 along the x-axis, that's a change of half of a unit. 1.5 minus 1 is a change of half of a unit. So it's right here. 3/2 is the same as 1.5. Minus 2/2, you're left with 1/2. And if you're starting at 7/2, which is the same as 3.5, and you're subtracting 4/2, I'm sorry, you're moving to 4/2, that's 4/2 minus 3/2. So 4/2 minus 3/2, 7/2 is the same as 3/2. Or 9/2, sorry about all this, 9/2 is the same as 4.5. So 9/2 minus 7/2 gets you to 2/2. Either way you do it, you get to 1. 1 divided by 1/2 is equal to 2. So how many halves are there in one thing? There are 2 of them, so that's equal to 2. And one more time, if you start at 1 and you go to 11/4, that's a change of 11/4 minus 1. Well, 11/4 is the same as 2 and 3/4. So 2 and 3/4 minus 1 is 1 and 3/4. We'll get to that in just a second. And then if you move from 7/2 to 7, 7 is the same as 14/2. So this is going to be 14/2 minus that 7/2. So that math is shown right here. So the change in y is 7 minus 7/2. 7 minus 7/2 is the same as 14/2 minus 7/2. And 11/4 minus 1 is right here. 11/4 minus 1. Easier to look at this as just changing the 1 to 4/4. So 11 minus 4 is 7/4. So right here we have 7/4. And the numerator is 7/2. So 7/2 divided by 7/4. The way to solve that is to multiply by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 7/4 is 4/7. The 7's cancel out. You're left with 4 divided by 2, or you can factor out the 4 to 2 times 2, and the 1 to 2 times 1. These 2's cancel. You're left with 2. So notice the slope of this line is 2, and you can tell that that's correct because every time you look at the vertical change compared to the horizontal change, you always get the same thing, 2 units. So for every unit in the horizontal direction, this line goes up 2 units in the vertical direction. So 1 unit in the horizontal direction for every 2 units. I should say 2 units in the vertical direction for every 1 unit in the horizontal direction. So if you look at the change for 1 here, you get a value of 2. The change for 2 here, this 2 and this 2, is this 2 right here. This is the math. You get a value of 2 and 3. This is 3 right here, and this is 3 right here. You get a value of 2. So the vertical change compared to the horizontal change is always 2. If it's a line that doesn't represent a proportional relationship. Actually, it'll be the same if it's a line that represents a proportional relationship. But for a proportional relationship, you can divide y divided by x, but you cannot do that if it's not a proportional relationship. So from this table, how do you tell? If it's 0, 0, if when x is 0, y is 0, then it's a proportional relationship. But if x is 0 and y is some number other than 0, in this case it's 3/2, then it's not a proportional relationship with a y-intercept of 3/2. A lot to think about as you go through this comparison.